meeting. We're going to discuss. Okay. We're going to discuss species recovery in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. There's the agenda on the screen. Unfortunately, Will has had to drop out because in the middle of intense work on the project he was going to talk about, so he's unable to join at the moment. So the timing will be a bit more relaxed, which will give some people perhaps a few more minutes to say what they wanted to say. But I do hope you'll all join in and ask questions and make comments after each of the speakers' presentations, and also when we get to the finish, let's have a discussion, because one of the things I wanted to discuss is whether we really need a consolidated species recovery plan for Cambridgeshire. So that was one thing I'd like to discuss at the end. So introduce myself. I'm a trustee, Roger Mitchell. I'm a trustee of Natural Cambridgeshire, and I've done a lot of work on species. I've had a long working life in ecology, a lot of it on species. I've worked for all sectors in academia, scientific publishing, NGOs, private sector, government, etc., etc. And a lot of that work has been on species. And I was really fortunate that one of my jobs, part of it was to be the account holder and manage the species recovery program for English Nature for 10 years, which I enjoyed thoroughly. Anyway, we're going to discuss species today, so you'll have a bit more of that from me. I want to do, in fact, let's just look at the program. Yes, you can see what the program we've got. So I'm going to do a general introduction in a minute. When we've got Phil Marks from Natural English, who's going to talk a bit about the sort of technicality or the how we the technicality of reintroductions and recovery. Gabriella is going to then talk about the local nature recovery strategy in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Then Sophie is going to talk about what they do with species in the middle level. And finally, Owen has joined us from Bucharest and is going to talk about the species in intensive farmland. So we'll come to that speaker by speaker. So just to introduce Natural Cambridgeshire, for those who don't know what we are a local nature partnership for Cambridgeshire Peterborough. This was a government's initiative in 2011, setting up these LMPs, and we were formally constituted in May 2012. They're the things we're supposed to do, or the government told us we're supposed to do, drive positive change in the local environment, to contribute to achieving government's national environmental objectives locally, and become local champions for decision making in the national environment. We are a charitable incorporated organization. One of the things we looked at early on, or reasonably early on, was so what have we got in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough? Well, we were aware some of these slides are a bit dated, as am I, but these two slides here showed that things are not doing particularly well, and farmland birds, woodland birds, and butterflies were all most of them going down. And we also recognise that in Cambridgeshire that we were not particularly well endowed with wildlife. We've got some superb nature reserves, but for the county as a whole, we had about half the rich wildlife habitats that the other counties have. That's half the average. So one of the things we thought we should do was to we want to have a vision, and our vision should be at least to bring Cambridgeshire up to the average of other counties in England. So we launched this doubling nature vision in 2019, and we thought that as Cambridgeshire is one of the fastest growing economies, we ought to be matching that with nature and nature recovery programs. Indeed, people coming to work in Cambridgeshire, want a nice environment, so let's help them get it. So our aim our sort of ambition is to see the area of rich wild habitats and the green space doubled from 8.5% to 17%. And a few of us also looked at, and we produced this leaflet on the left all about this, which is available on our website. A few of us also looked at where this doubling could be. And it's a bit surprising, really, or it did surprise me, because we found that development of green space would only contribute about 6%, and that's including biodiversity net gain. And if with these huge nature conservation projects like the Great Fen and Wicken Fen extending, and all the others, that would contribute 18%, which is great. But the biggest gains would have to be and would be on through agri-environment on arable land, on agricultural land. So it was a bit of a surprising pie chart. But sorry, let me do that properly. Yeah. But talking about where this might be, I mean, one of the big areas we've got of arable and farmland is our Fenland Basin. And I call it the blue network. Look at that blue network. And I know Sophie's going to talk about this, but I think that we can get some of the biggest gains here. There's
Yes.
hundreds of kilometers of Fenland waterways, and there's some pictures of them there. I did a little study commissioned by the Environment Agency and the Association of Drainage Authorities, which is that booklet there, looking at how we could get good ecological potential in these Fenland water bodies. And that report I wrote indicates the many ways in which you can raise wildlife. And Sophie will tell us a lot more about this because she did an even bigger and better report later on. So we must think about this blue network. Another little review is talking about we've lost a lot in Cambridgeshire, or at least we haven't got as much as we probably should have. We have lost things too, like across the whole of the country. I mean, the sturgeon used to come of our rivers and doesn't anymore. The burbot was in the Ouse in the 1970s, is not there anymore, possibly because it's getting too warm now. We used to have this wonderful pool frog locally, and I also am a trustee of Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust, and we'd love to get that back into the fens. The adder, as a boy, I used to see some Bedford pearlies. I believe it actually is back now. Someone told me it's back in Hampton, but I'm not sure about that. We've lost the fen orchid. We've lost the water soldier. We've lost the red squirrel. And of course, the cause of that was the grey squirrel. When I was managing species recovery program for English Nature, we tried desperately to save the last 100 red squirrels in Thetford Forest by eliminating lots of grey squirrels and making a red squirrel reserve. We failed, but what we did succeed, we actually found out that, of course, it was the grey squirrels carrying parapox, which they were slightly resistant to, which was killing the reds. We've lost the large copper. The last few went from Woodwalton Fen, in the 90s. The swallowtails vanished. I think it was last seen in Wicken Fen. Interestingly, again, when I was quite young, I remember talking to some old guys in Wicken who used to cut the sedge, and they told me, they used to collect the pupae and larvae and whatever else and sell them to the butterfly trade. So that was undoubtedly causing their decline as well. And again, as a young conservationist, I used to see the checkered skipper at Castor Hanglands Nature Reserve, and that's gone and collected out. Although there was an introduction locally, I think again in the Bedford Purleys area. I hope that's taken. We haven't got any stone curlew anymore. I don't know when the last pine marten was in the area. When I was managing the species recovery program, we did put in a plan to get it back into southern England, although our then chairman didn't want us to do that because he felt the chicken farmers wouldn't like it, etc., etc. So we did, as officers, work under constraints of what other people would think if we got the wrong species in. Yes, I mentioned the large copper and the swallowtail. This undoubtedly was partly caused by overcollecting, but also partly caused by the fact that we didn't have the extensive habitat that these species like. And that's what we found time and time again in species recovery, that we'd often find the last species clinging to a remnant of their last habitat and obviously getting properly genetically inbred and hence not doing particularly well. So although they were there, it didn't mean that they were there to stay. They're on their last legs. But some species have recovered in the area. We've got the water voles come back quite strongly, partly through habitat management, but mostly getting rid of the mink or start to get rid of the mink. We put dormouse back into Brampton Wood, and that's doing quite well. And you've all seen the red kites, which were introduced in the 1990s. I mean, they're doing incredibly well. The water germander has been reintroduced, quite a rare plant, reintroduced to Kingfisher's Bridge and is around the millions. The fantastic work of the RSPB and others in the Ouse Valley has got the bittern back in large numbers. The fen violet sort of come back. It likes disturbance. People tell me that disturbance is like what the aurochs used to do when they used to create their wallows. And indeed, when I worked at with well, I think it was Owen Mountford himself and others on this, we did find that if you disturbed the soil deliberately or even accidentally by pulling up trees and things, the fen violet loved it. In fact, this happened in Oxfordshire. It had vanished from its site in Otmore, and the site in Otmore was a shooting range, and the army wanted to widen the shooting range and pulled up the trees at the edge, and up popped the fen violet. Seas really like that. Fen ragwort vanished for over 100 years and suddenly popped up in a ditch near Ely. That's been reintroduced to several sites, and I don't think it's doing particularly well. Another species which hasn't really come back but is there is the Chinese water deer, and we have to consider that we've got a lot of non-native species, but in fact the populations of our Chinese water deer in this area are of international importance. So amongst the things we think are native or are native, we perhaps have some responsibility to serve some of these non-natives too, which are internationally important. Sorry. So other things, finding the way back. Again, the cranes are doing very well now. They've come back into the area again, mainly with some reintroductions earlier on, but certainly with managing the habitats properly. The buzzard and the sparrowhawk are doing very well locally. Again, when I was a lad, they weren't here. The gamekeepers delighted in shooting all these species. That was their job, and hanging their poor carcasses on their gibbets outside their cottages, and God, didn't it stink. But what a change, and it's lovely to see these species back in the area. The polecats crept in from the west. We've got the large and the great egret and small egret back in pretty good numbers now. The purple emperor is in our woodlands, flying around the tops of our oaks. This spider, the wasp spider, is coming from the continent and has spread north. Roselle's bush cricket was pretty well confined to some sort of sea edges and is now spreading rapidly over Britain. I mean, some of these things are habitat change, some of them the lack of persecution, some of them habitat management, but at least some of the species are finding their way back. What I'd like to do at the end of this talk is to think a bit more about a species recovery program for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. What can we learn from and build on all that's been tried and achieved so far? Would it be a good idea to coordinate effort and cooperate between the ongoing projects and strategically plan new species recovery efforts together, and to set targets for success? What species should we be working on? And Gabriella will talk a bit about that. And what would success look like? I will mention the word favorable conservation status. That is often the technical word for the successful species, and maybe we can discuss that later. So that's my sort of introduction. I'm going to stop sharing. I won't invite any questions on that because I'd like to. If there's any questions on that, you can ask me those later. But I'd like to go straight into the second presentation, which is Phil Marks. So can Phil's slide be put up? Well, I'll introduce him. Phil is the Species Reintroductions and Recovery Lead Advisor for the West Anglia team in Natural England. He sits in the area team and works with the Natural England Species Specialist, Species Reintroduction Team and the Species Network to support and advise on reintroduction projects, the Species Recovery Programme and research on species ecology to enable species recovery along the recovery curve. And his area geography stretches from the estuaries of Essex, the chalk streams from Hertfordshire, the woodlands of Northants and our fens. So over to you, Phil.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Roger, for the introduction. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. And can you see the screen as well?
Yeah. Can I just say, if everyone else tries to mute, please, that'll make it clearer for everybody. And also, if you've got questions, you can raise your hand at the time, but also put questions into the chat. Thank you.
So Phil, could you just put your slides onto sort of the presentation mode? We can see the next slide and the existing slide.
Can you see your face?
Is that better?
Yeah,
that's fine.
Good.
Perfect. Okie dokie. Well, in which case, I'm just going to go through a number of different topics around reintroductions and code of reintroductions, and just discuss some of those terms that get pulled out quite regularly, bringing it back to our abundance and extinction risk targets, and then looking about how we're embedding actions for species and how we would like, perhaps through a species recovery programme for Cambridgeshire, to embed actions for species at scale as well, and bringing that back to our abundance extinction risk targets, and then hopefully tee up Gabriella, who's next, talking about prioritisation of species and species within the LNRS and how we look at that within Natural England. So why species? Species are critical components and indicators of rich and healthy and resilient ecosystems. They provide ecosystem services, including pollination, water retention, and recreational opportunities, connecting people with nature. And also, as Lawton said, species keep conservation honest. They're the foremost measure of success in nature recovery efforts. So what we have is a reintroduction code of conduct for England. And you might have already read this. If not, it'll be useful if you to have a look through it. It's a 51-page document. It just sort of highlights, when you're putting a project together, some of the questions that shape that project as it's going along. And what it's sort of looking at is whether the translocation is appropriate, increasing chances of success, and reducing likelihoods of any problems and conflicts. It's sort of set around 9 guiding principles. Those principles are to identify the conservation need and set goals. Principle 2 is to evaluate whether conservation translocation is an appropriate option. Principle 3, where translocation is appropriate, develop a plan. Principle 4 is to get permission, meet legislation and follow good practice. Principle 5, maximise chances of successful establishment. Principle 6, maximise the benefits and minimise the risk of harm to biodiversity through the processes. Principle 7, consider societal benefits and minimise conflict with others. Principle 8, show accountability, transparency and openness. And Principle 9, record translocations and monitor afterwards, evaluating the success or failure of the project and communicating those outcomes, even if a project fails in establishing a species to a site where it was lost. Sometimes the learning that comes out of that is really valuable in delivering projects in the future. One of the things it does keep coming back to, though, is it highlights the need for disease risk assessment and animal health surveillance in our reintroduction programs, and also a management and exit strategy to make sure that even after the project has delivered its goals of reintroducing the species, that we're able to maintain the species afterwards, rather than just sort of walking away and losing them, and studying, if we do lose them, why we're losing them, so that next time round we can grow on that discovery and that information. Helpfully, the project comes with a scoping form. This is part of the scoping form, and we use this a lot within our own work within Natural England, and it just highlights some of the gaps that might be filling as you're going through creating your project, identifying where the risks are or where knowledge is lacking, and then that'll help us to prioritize what sort of work needs to be done before necessarily establishing a new population through reintroduction. The number of different terminologies that come out of that: conservation, introduction, translocations outside of focal species, natural range, assisted colonization, the establishment of populations in locations where the current or future conditions are more suitable than the species' natural range, thinking climate change modelling. Ecological replacement, where translocation of an organism to perform a specific ecological function has been lost through the extinction of another organism. Population restoration, conservation translocations within a focal species range. Reinforcement, this is where the translocation of an organism into an existing population of the same species to improve population size and genetic diversity. So thinking the checkered skippers over sort of fine shades, Bedford Purlieu's area. And reintroduction as well, translocation of organism to an area from which it has been lost. So just thinking back to Roger's slide, swallowtails, large coppers, for example. Just taking that back to our legislative targets, species abundance targets and our species extinction risk targets. It requires the government to halt decline of species by 2030 and improve abundance by a minimum of 10% on that by 2042. The extinction risk targets is, in 2042, improving their species statuses compared to 2022. And it's perhaps the most significant influence in our thinking about current priorities is understanding the extinction risk faced by our native species, as determined and expressed through a series of GB IUCN Red List assessments, for which there's now that for over 15,000 species across different taxonomic groups, which wasn't available at the time of the Section 41 lists, which had previously been used. And just some of the figures that come out of that: 640 species, that's 56%, within S41 listed by virtue only. 640 of those species are now known to be, another 640 least concern. Nearly 600 other species that are now considered GB Red List threatened species, so vulnerable, endangered and critically endangered, are not listed on the UK BAT, and subsequently not under Section 41. So we're sort of moving away from those early 2000 priorities and using the Red List as well. And on the right, you can see an image, the outcome indicator framework for the environmental plan, the D5 status for our native species, which is sort of shaping how we prioritize our species and how we report on that as well. And that's another really useful document to look through, and when you're planning a project, putting out some of their findings and some of their information in there, which I shall highlight a little bit later on. So actions for species based on those targets and based on the translocation code. So firstly, what do we want? We want a thriving climate adapted network of naturally functioning ecosystems to support diverse self-sustaining populations of native terrestrial, freshwater and marine species. The recovery of threatened species and other formerly widespread species. Looking at appropriateness, the reintroduction of formerly native species and the population reinforcement of those on the brink of extinction. And then the awareness, bringing that connecting people with nature sort of work stream into focus here, sort of making sure that they have an awareness, an interest and a stake in those projects within their local areas, driving that interest through species. So sort of breaking that down a little bit further, setting up projects and how we set things up in Natural England throughout all of our work streams, thinking from sustainable development to agri-environment to our protected sites work, is when we're looking at projects focusing on species and scaling up for species from the local level to a landscape scale. within our thinking, making it multi-taxa and assemblage working, and sort of trying to encompass benefits for other species when you have a focal species, a flagship species, make sure that you are delivering across different taxas as well throughout the project. All of our work is science and evidence led. So, understanding where species is on its recovery curve, what do we know, building up that science, trying out novel techniques, building up the evidence base to drive policy and drive our delivery in the environment. Working with others to broaden and enrich partnerships. We all have different focus taxes, we all have different areas of expertise, and making sure that we bring everybody together in a room and understanding how we can really enrich projects and deliver that multi-taxa assemblage working. And again, connecting people with nature, engaging people with the species to inspire them to connect and act for nature, both now and in the future. And finally, isolating a clear role for species reintroductions. When in Natural England, that currently looks like this. So scaling up the species recovery programme, we've always had the memorandums of agreement, the research and development and trialling novel techniques. We've recently, and we're currently going through the first round of the capital grant scheme for the species recovery programme, working species along their species recovery curve. NRN, one of the many acronyms that you encounter within Natural England, Nature Recovery Network, that delivers and benefits the species on scale. So looking at the local nature recovery strategies, our protected site strategies and nature recovery projects in and around the different counties. Embedding species into ELMS, looking at the SP4, the species invasive species supplement, making sure that we're utilising to the best of its ability the species, the threatened species supplement SP9 as well, and delivering that through ELMS and making sure that our schemes are growing and nature rich as well, and working not just for abundance but also for the extinction risk targets. We've got the reintroduction task force, invasive non-native species strategies. As again Roger mentioned earlier, favourable conservation status. We're working to increase the number of species that are listed under that at the moment, and having outcomes for those species and action plans as well to go alongside those. The D5 target for governance and reporting for species. Geographic targeting tools are being trialled at the moment as well to make sure that we deliver that landscape scale connectivity, more, bigger, better. Making sure that within Natural England, we're not just focused on our terrestrial species, but also working with other organisations to deliver for marine species and in that coastal zones as well. And understanding the future of our funding, both government funding and green finance and private finance, the different new schemes that are coming out, the biodiversity net gain, making sure that we can really utilise those for species extinction risks, making sure that carbon credits are functioning the right way to deliver for our native species as well, and making sure that we're ready for when those are up, running and in depth as well. So prioritisation, like I said, we're moving away from the section 41. We're using the red list, which looks like this spreadsheet here, identifying species based on their statuses, so critically endangered, vulnerable, endangered, as your priorities, and then extending out of that from your near threatened as well, and looking at our extinct species or locally extinct species and trying to understand why they went extinct and how to bring those back, and identifying within those particular scales what work needs to be done. So again, species recovery curve that came back from back to the Brink project, understanding diagnosis of decline, solution testing. Where does the species on that red list sit? Why is it critically endangered? Do we know what the threats are that are causing that? Do we know what solutions there are to deploy to move that along the recovery curve? And once we've identified where on that scale a species is, we can start isolating funding, driving it in that direction and working a species along its recovery curve. And in terms of abundance, the work also delivering for the wider environment as well. Hopefully we will all end up at section 9, the sustainable management. That's the end goal, the favourable conservation status, section 9. I just thought I'd add this as well. This is pulled out of the D5 indicator. And I think this is a stark reminder, it is always for me as well, about our species and our taxa and where they are in terms of extinction risk. And it's quite a sorry image. But also when you're focusing on a particular species or in a particular taxa, making sure that you're adding to that wider picture and you're bringing those other species along their recovery curve, reducing the risk of their extinction as well. Everything's connected. Ooh. And my PowerPoint seems to have given up. There we go. So just going on to that prioritization process, species within the LNRS, and I hope that I'm setting up Gabriella here with this. We've got 48 local nature recovery strategies across England as a whole, and it's all part of planning a coherent ecological network, that more, bigger, better connected habitats at local level to help local species and populations thrive, and making sure they're connected as well on a larger scale across those 48 different local nature recovery strategies, those LNRSs, identifying threatened species as part of that, and other locally significant species are relevant to the strategy area, and determining which species should be prioritised and targeted for recovery action. I think the key thing that I keep bringing up with this is iteration number 1. So where we've got a long list of species that is quite exhaustive, working that down to a short list and highlighting those priorities for now. There will be other iterations, and the idea is that those species will be working along their recovery curve to the point that we can start to pull them away from being a priority within the LNRS and bring another species into that focus. And that long list was derived by a table or based on actions. So E, F, and G here needs better evidence base, needs action outside of England, vagrants, occasional visitors, so not suitable for the LNRS, which is why they were never mentioned. Looking at what should be within the LNRS and that long list, C and D needs improvement in environmental quality, needs bespoke conservation actions to recover a species along its recovery curve, needs targeted habitat management as well, and can also be fitted in with that bigger, that better connected to habitat. Part of the process as well is not listing what we've got, but listing possible translocation species and understanding what our priorities are there, using that code of reintroduction to bring the species back, whether that is through population reinforcement or looking at reintroducing a species that we've lost. Again, coming back to swallowtails and large coppers that Roger was mentioning earlier, and the pool frog as well, that was on the chart. So questions and discussions, I'm very happy to take questions, and I'm really hoping for a good discussion around that. If you've got a species in mind that you're looking at for a project, if you're thinking about reintroductions, if you've got one in your mind now, please do mention it in the chat or raise your hand, and we can have a chat about it. If I don't know the answer, I can come back to you with one. I'm just hoping for a rich discussion about the extinction risk targets, about our code of reintroductions, and building bigger, better projects, rich for nature, that delivers across different taxa as well. Just thinking back to those guiding principles there of a species recovery action plan. So any questions?
Thank you, Roger, indeed, Phil. Okay, I'm looking at questions in the chat. A comment from there's a comment aimed at me about dormice and Brampton. Well, they're only hanging on now. I think I said they were doing well. So I'm sorry about that. We've always got to boost their population. Sue James has a question. As a non-specialist, when it comes to introductions, how do we ensure that you have a sustainable species balance? Also, will climate change make a difference to the species that can survive in the changing environment? Gosh, that's a very broad question. Do you want to have a go at that, Phil?
Yeah, let me just bring the chat up there so I can just pick through that. Sustainable species balance. Yeah, that is a tricky one to answer, and I suppose it comes back down to your project, and it comes back down to your focus species, and just trying to understand at what level it's sustainable as a population. It will be different across the board, and that will come out as you're planning planning your project, when you're looking at your exit strategy, it just depends on your taxa, it depends on your species. It's quite a hard one to answer. In terms of, you know, a balance of species, I think a good one, if you're picking a species out, for me, would be turtle dove, just because of its wide range of habitats that it does utilize. You know, it needs the nesting habitat is scrub, and what others, you know, loads of other species require scrub. You're bringing in some of those rare arable flora into the environment as well, supporting other bird species as well as the turtle dove. So the knock-on effect of working for turtle doves, you know, you're having corn bunting, yellowhammer down the line as well. And then water and bare ground. So you're thinking of your mining bees, your bare ground scrapes that they will utilize. You're looking at the water courses that they will also utilize. So if you're creating ponds, you're talking about your amphibians as well. You're talking about odonata, your dragonflies. So if you're looking for a balance of species, you maybe pick a flagship that you're working on within an area that has wide-ranging knock-on multi-taxa benefits there. I hope that answers the question, and I'm not just...
Can I just say what I was really meaning, because I'm not a specialist in any way, I'm an architect, but it was trying to say, you know, I'm sitting here in West Wales at the moment. Farmland's devastated around us. We've got a lot of trees and woodland. We've got a magnificent collection of magpies, a couple of jaybirds, small birds devastated, no butterflies, one bee trying to do the whole area. It can only be bothered to do the bottom flower of any foxglove because it's got to press on. You know, it's kind of, if you get one, and the grey squirrels have just stripped 2 beech trees, you know, young beech, very successfully, and I can hear them chewing the bark as I, you know, speak virtually. How do you actually make sure that you get a balance so that you don't get predominant species that then destroy the ones that you're carefully introducing? You know, I mean, nature kind of knows how to do it if we kept out of the way, but we've caused so much havoc that I can see it getting very sort of unbalanced and not really working. That was what I was trying to say by sustainable, whatever, species balance.
Yeah, so yeah, not introducing something that perhaps dominates.
It becomes so successful. I mean, we've got red kites coming out of our ears at the moment. Everything else is sort of in despair, you know, sort of.
Yeah, I suppose it would depend on, again, the species that you're going to focus on, maybe as a flagship or maybe as an individual species, and highlighting perhaps when you're going through that form the risk that has with that. So you don't want to decimate your small rodent population by introducing one particular species, and if that's going to be the case, then looking at how you can support that rodent population, make sure that the food sources are for the maybe perhaps more dominant species is sustainable in its own right. The conversation I keep running into is like redback shrike, for example. When you could introduce that, but it would decimate potentially the insect populations when they're already declining. So how do you create those the larger invertebrates that the redback shrike would feed on within the landscape and making sure that's sustainable? So it's about peeling back from that species and just understanding its ecology. And if we don't understand its ecology, that's definitely the starting point. So if we're struggling to understand how that species works, going back to that species recovery curve and just understanding A, why it was lost in the first place, and B, if reintroducing it's going to cause its crash again in its own right, then, or crash of other species, then it's not an appropriate species to then move forward from. And then you can move away from that discussion and start looking at different species or different taxas to start building up that fully functioning ecosystem.
But thanks for I think some of this stuff we can take that forward to the general discussion at the end, because these are very, very big questions with very big answers. Just to look briefly before we move on at what's in the chat. I mean, Peter Lanshoff says, do invasive species come to your remit? Well, I'm going to ask that quickly. That they should come into a remit. I mean, I mentioned the grey squirrel, and we were trying to get rid of that to get the red squirrel back. I worked on the southern heathlands with the ladybird spider, and we were getting rid of the rhododendrons and other scrub species to create open heath for the ladybird spider. In fact, we do that for sand lizard and smooth snakes and other snakes as well. So yes, in control of invasive species certainly comes into species recovery. Richard Kay is talking about that we should be having this huge value in public friendly species, and there's the East Cambs hedgehog program. I mean, I certainly agree with that. These, I mean, I suppose you'd call them flagship species, and some of these flagship species should definitely be charismatic species, because as Phil said, we've got to engage the public. So yeah, plus, but Phil might want to come back to that later. And Owen's got a comment there. Owen, can we leave your comment to the general discussion? Because I think it's a very valuable one. Okay, well, there's one on Chinese water deer by Martin Parsons as well. Oh, quite a lot there. Large mouse grasshopper. Okay, well, I'll have to leave some of these till the next to out of the general discussion, because we haven't got time to go through them now. So I'd like to move on to the next presentation, which is Gabriella. So while Gabriella's slides are being put up, I'll just introduce her. Gabriella works for Cambridgeshire County Council, and she's been with them since 2019, working on various environmental related programs, including the LNRS since December 2022. In fact, I think I first encountered you, Gabriella, at a health a meeting in the early days, but there we are. Okay, over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you. Can I just confirm, one, you can hear me, and two, you can see my slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger, and thank you for inviting me along today to give an update on the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough local nature recovery strategy. As Roger mentioned, and the main theme of today's discussion is around species. So alongside the update I'm going to give on the overall project, we will be honing in on the species recovery work stream that both Phil and Roger have mentioned, and kind of giving you an update on that process so far and next steps. So before I move on to giving an update and talking about the species recovery, for those of you that aren't aware, I'll just give a brief overview of what is a local nature recovery strategy. So local nature recovery strategies, or LNRSs, are a system of spatial strategies for nature improvements and are required under law by the Environment Act. Their purpose is to identify locations where we can create or improve habitat that is most likely to have the greatest benefit for nature and the wider environment. They must contain two components, the first one being a local habitat map that identifies national conservation sites, local nature reserves, area of particular importance, and areas that could become of particular importance. And then secondly, the statement of biodiversity priorities that includes a description of our strategy area and its biodiversity, the opportunities for recovering nature, the priorities for recovering and enhancing biodiversity, and those proposed potential measures to help with those priorities. It's mainly this second component that the species recovery stuff will feed into and be included in. So progress so far on the LNRS. I came to the Partnership Forum back in March, and I gave an update then about how we're progressing. And at the time, I had mentioned that we had done a lot of stakeholder engagement work, gone to many events, and we had released a public survey. And I'm really pleased to note that we've received over 1,300 responses from that public survey. And the responses from that have been incorporated into identifying a priority habitat long list, but also incorporated into the species recovery work that I'm going to come on to shortly. We've going to shortly commence, or have just commenced, our prioritisation process, which is refining that priority habitat long list into a much shorter list that is manageable and achievable. We've also we had completed our baseline habitat mapping, and we've used that to start drafting our local habitat maps, opportunity maps, connectivity maps, and the species maps. And we're going to start testing those mapping outputs with experts to get on the ground knowledge and incorporating that information into those maps. The first draft chapters of our strategy have been reviewed by our steering group, and that is proceeding accordingly. With regards to next steps, we're very much now in the testing phase and refining phase. So with regards to our stakeholder engagement work stream, we're now testing that priority habitat shortlist and feeding that into the next draft of the LNRS. It's the same with the data and evidence work stream. We're testing those mapping outputs with stakeholders and partners, and we'll be feeding them into the final, well, the consultation draft of the LNRS. And our consultants, LUC, are currently working on drafting the next chapters, which all of that information will feed into. So species recovery in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Before I commence with talking about the process that's been undertaken, I just really want to highlight that this work you're going to see today has not been completed by myself. It's actually been completed by our local record centre, CPERC, and they have done a fabulous job on creating our long list, our short list, and then our soon-to-be priority list. Unfortunately, Phil Ricketts, who's been undertaking this work, couldn't be here today because they're in the midst of their monitoring and research of all their different species and updating their records. But if there's any questions that come out of this today, I would like to take them away and have a discussion with Phil, and we can come back to the group. So as stated in the guidance for the LNRS, it must describe opportunities, set priorities, and propose potential measures for the recovery and enhancement of species. So to do this, we've refined that guidance down into 3 simple steps. And this follows on from what Mark was saying in his presentation with his table and the different categories. So the first step is to create a long list, and we identified about 700 odd species in that long list. That long list was then refined down a couple of times into a shorter list, and the final short list has about 132 species. And the next step, which we are currently in that process of doing the final step, is identifying that priority list, which at the moment has a question mark over it of what number of species will be included in that. But our current aim is between about 25 to 30 species. So step 1, how did we, or I say we, CPERC, develop the long list? So they went away and they identified species under the following designations. So the IUCN Great Britain Red List Threatened or Near Threatened List, the UK Biodiversity Action Plan Priority Species List, the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Additional Species of Interest List, the IUCN England Red List of Threatened Plants, Birds of Conservation and Concerns of the Red List, and then Nationally Rare. So we looked at all of those lists and we compiled together all of the species. And then within that, CPERC also included their own records from their own database. So that's post 1970. And then once that list was compiled, CPERC then circulated it to about 40 local experts and local recorders who have that really detailed on the ground knowledge about different species and taxes. And they incorporated their own expertise into this long list. So the next step, once we got that final long list, which was about 700 odd species, was to refine it into a shorter list. And to do this, we set up a working group that met first in April and have been meeting on about a monthly basis. And using that criteria that, again, Phil mentioned in his presentation, CPERC refined it down further to have 3 simple criteria when it comes to refining down that long list into a shorter list. The first one being threat. So is this species at a significant threat or at risk of severe population decline or extinction within Cambridgeshire and Peterborough? Again, we're at a local level. The significance, are these species native to Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and have long-standing populations? And deliverability. Can we deliver this species recovery within this edition of the LNRS? So that's about 3 to 10 years' time. It's also important to note that what was also incorporated into this short list was the findings and outputs from our public survey. So similar to what Richard Kay put in the chat about the public's perception, we took what we found in our public survey and incorporated those species that had been mentioned by the members of the public and incorporated that also into this short list. So our final step, which we're currently in the process of doing, is identifying that priority list of species to then be included in the draft, the consultation draft of the LNRS. So CPAC currently are now seeking further expert clarification. We'll be taking about those 132 species and putting them into different habitat assemblages. And doing that within that process, we'll identify species that cannot be put into a habitat assemblage or need really detailed specific actions. And it's those species that need those detailed specific actions that will be incorporated into our priority list. Assigning potential measures, so those are the actions that would help deliver the species recovery, and then also identifying those important sites where those species are found within. So I've spoken about the species recovery side of things and the process that we've taken to date, but also within the LNRS, we need to consider habitat prioritisation, because as it's already been mentioned today, you know, the species won't thrive if you don't have the right habitat or the right ecological knowledge behind it. So we are currently in the process of identifying and agreeing our habitat priorities within the LNRS, and it's these priorities that those species will be put into those habitat assemblages. So what is a priority? These are the end result of what the strategy is trying to seek. So these are the top priorities that we've identified within Cambridgeshire and Peterborough that are important. I won't focus too much on this slide, but it just dictates the kind of process that we've taken. So again, in early January, we had a load of stakeholder engagement events, and we asked people to identify their top priorities. We also did a bunch of desk-based research to understand what are existing priorities within Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. All of that information was incorporated into a biodiversity priority long list that was refined with expert help. And we've just commenced our prioritisation process. So that is taking this long list to a much shorter list. We're doing that in two ways. We're having an expert-led shortlisting and then including the wider stakeholder preference. We had our first workshop yesterday with our experts, which was identifying that much shorter list. And we will be shortly circulating that out to everyone to review and feedback to. And that's making sure we're including that wider public perception. So our aim is to have a short list of priorities agreed by the end of June, beginning of July. So just gonna end out here that if you haven't heard from us before, or you're not quite sure what the LNRS is, or if you would like to know more, then please do get in contact. We will be circulating that short list of nature recovery priorities shortly. So keep an eye out on that. If you're not on our distribution list or you haven't heard from us before, then please do drop us an email at the local nature recovery strategy at cambridgeshire.gov.uk. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, but again, if there's questions that I can't answer, I will take them away and feedback to the group at a later date.
Thank you very much indeed, Gabriella. Well, we've now had sort of both from Gabriella and Phil sort of introduction to the sort of the technicalities and the almost the philosophy behind species recovery and its connection with habitats through the LNRS. There's some nice questions coming up in the chat. I mean, we've had an exchange between Phil and Richard Kay about these charismatic species. I mean, agreeing we do need to focus on some charismatic species to engage the public, but we cannot solely focus on those where other actions are required. So there's sort of general agreement there. Now, there's one on particularly LNRS. Where's that from? That was from Sue James. Sue, would you like to address those questions then to Gabriella?
Okay, yes. So one of the things that interests me is getting connectivity across the board, and I always worry that we do things, in individual bits. So I just wondered whether all the LNRSs that are being prepared are actually have got one of their requirements is they're actually linked to the wider green, framework.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So at the end, once all of our LNRSs are published and signed off, then we will be handing that information back to DEFRA, and that will link up to the wider National Nature Recovery Network. So the idea is that all these 48 different LNRSs will connect up and join and create that England Nature Recovery Network. one of the things we have to consider is cross-boundary opportunities. So I'm in constant communication with our neighbouring authorities as well. So Essex, Hertfordshire, Norfolk and Suffolk, Bedfordshire, all the neighbouring authorities that are leading on their own LNRS, I'm in constant communication with, and we're constantly conversing and seeing what they're doing there and what we're doing here, and just it's information sharing. And I think that's really important, is to share information so we can connect up.
So that's really encouraging. So on the second part of that is, when you're preparing an LNRS, are you also considering the tree strategy, the green infrastructure strategy, the climate adaptation strategies, and all the other things that are...
Absolutely. So the LNRS, you know, we really want to build on the existing policies and strategies that are happening within the county. You know, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to just go, this is what you should do, and then it doesn't actually line up with those other policies. So that's why I mentioned in one of my slides that we did a lot of desk-based research, and we identified those kind of policies or priorities in those different strategies and fed them into that long list, so they're included in that sense. And we're very much hoping to reference those different policies from different organisations.
And with biodiversity net gain, I won't get started on that, but the habitat, these sort of habitat banks that people are rushing around kind of doing and buying up land to do and so on, I mean, there doesn't seem to be any obligation on their part to make sure they are placed as part of an LNRS, for example. Or is there?
My knowledge of biodiversity net gain isn't huge, but what I am aware is that if a developer places their B&G in an area that's been identified as a priority in the LNRS, then there is an uplift in the B&G matrix, so they get more credits. I'm not sure how much more credits they have, and I would welcome someone that has more knowledge than me, if there's any ecologists here in the room. But the idea is that B&G and the LNRS is meant to work together to ensure that.
But the land bought for the habitat banking needs to actually be part of this connectivity thing. So I just wonder if we've got any control over where that can be, so we can be ensured that it's connected. Otherwise, the ones I've seen are just completely isolated with no responsibility.
I think that's a very good point, and I'm more than happy to take that away and to review that in our process so far.
Thank you. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now there's some questions here which are probably also for the general discussion as well, about how does all this fit with plans for increasing urbanisation, the development of the East-West Rail. That's from Elizabeth May, and Sharon also wonders about the impact of the East-West Rail. I'm not sure whether, Gabriella, you want to try and answer that, but I mean, it's really balancing, you know, what's happening against what we've got, what we're intending to do. Do you want to have a go at
that? I wouldn't even know where to start, to be honest. I'm happy to. We have had a few not direct conversations with East-West Rail, but it's an ongoing conversation that I'm aware that a lot of sort of different stakeholders are happening in sense of biodiversity and nature recovery and that side of things.
But there's all linked to biodiversity net gain, because all these developments, whether it's housing or major things, they're supposed to be producing more than we lose. But I use the word supposedly, advisedly. Okay, we could probably do more of that in the general discussion. Kevin asks a specific question about Cambridgeshire elms. There's at least one unique endemic species in Cambridgeshire. I think, you know, there's been about 50 different species in Cambridgeshire, but I don't know whether, Gabriella, they're in the list that you're dealing with.
I wouldn't know directly off the top of my head, but if sorry, I forgot this person's name, but if you want to contact us directly with further information, then I can pass that on and see, just to make sure it's been included, or if it's not included, give you a reason as why it's not been included.
Okay. And the other questions, specific ones, are being asked and answered in the chat, so I'll leave that there. I think, well, thank you again, Gabriella, and we'll move on to the next speaker, which is Sofi Lloyd. While Sofi's slides are being put up, I'll introduce her. She's Sofi's worked for the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Association of Drainage Authorities, where she produced a splendid, nearly 200-page report which is called Environmental Good Governance Guide for Internal Drainage Boards, a real opus magnus. And she's now in the Environment Officer and Ecology Consultant with the middle level commissioners. And maybe, Sophie, at some point you should tell people who don't know what the middle commissioners do, middle level commissioners do. I'm sure you're going to do that. Okay, over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Roger. Can you see my slides and can you hear me okay?
Yes and yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roger, for that introduction. And indeed, Roger, I'm going to take the opportunity to, oh, I can't make my slides work. There we go. I'm going to take the opportunity to just try and explain a little bit more about internal drainage boards and the middle level commissioners. So apologies if you are familiar with this industry and the role and functions of internal drainage boards, but many aren't. And we're a major sort of element of the landscape in Cambridgeshire. So, you know, hopefully this is helpful for those that don't have as good an understanding. And it is quite complicated. So middle level commissioners is an internal drainage board. And internal drainage boards manage flood risk and water levels in low-lying areas of the country. And what you're seeing on your screen at the moment is the middle level commissioners catchment. Now, these the catchment really operates as you would expect a normal river basin catchment to operate, in that it sort of has a catchment of water, but unlike a natural catchment, really, it can't drain by gravity into a tidal river because it's a bowl and it sits below sea level. So the channels that you see on the screen within that catchment are called middle level main drains, and they act as what would be natural main rivers in a normal catchment, if you like. The only difference is, as I say, those rivers don't flow naturally via gravity. We have pumping stations that pump the water from the middle level catchment that you see and from those channels that you see, ultimately out into the tidal river Great Ouse, right at the top right of your screen near King's Lynn, through St Germans pumping station, which was the largest pumping station in Europe for a while, but I think we've now been picked to the post by one in Europe. So internal drainage boards are managed and run by sort of a group of major landowners and stakeholders in the area. They're volunteers, they don't get paid, but they are responsible for managing flood risk and water levels in their discrete sub-catchment within the middle level area. So that could be the stakeholders will be, you know, major farm owners, landowners, but also the local authorities will be on that board to represent the residential and the business residents in that catchment that benefit from the flood risk and water level management there. So they're a public body because they are funded with public money. Residential contributions are collected through council tax and paid to internal drainage boards by local authorities. Farmers and major farmers and landowners pay drainage rates to the internal drainage board as they benefit from their activities also. So as a public body, we've got a number of statutory duties around the environment, which I'll go into a little bit more about. So it's those internal drainage boards that manage the maintenance of the channels within their subcatchments and manage the pumping stations to make sure that that water is managed favourably within the catchment. So Middle Level itself was formed in 1862, and it has a range of legislation that is unique to the Middle Level, actually. So we've got the Knee Navigation Act, which goes back to the 1973. There's a number of middle level acts which go back to 1810, and all of those really have a focus on land drainage for agricultural production. So the middle level channels range across 192 kilometres. We've got 192 kilometres of main river channel within that catchment that you see. And I don't know if you can see right down sort of in the bottom left, we've got some of the southern catchments, which is down near the A1. That's a long way to get that all the way up to King's Lynn. So we've got two main pumping stations, one at Bevilsleam near Ponders Bridge. That kind of adds sort of a boost to the flow to get some of the water that's in the southern catchment all the way up to King's Lynn. So we're also the third largest navigation authority in the UK. So we've got a number of sort of priorities that we have to focus on, and these channels have to be multifunctional. So this hopefully gives you an idea of sort of the complexity of some of the channels. So in terms of water levels, we have to keep water levels up for irrigators so that they've got enough water to irrigate the crops in summer. We have to keep it down to manage flood risk. We've got to have it not so high that boats can't get under bridges on the channels. We have to have it not too low so boats don't float. We have to have enough vegetation in the channels to benefit ecology and species, but not too much that boats can't go through. So it's a very complex system to manage, and there's not a lot of tolerance there, but we try and do our best. And it's important to say that this situation is unique in the country. The way that we operate in the middle level, there is no other area in the country that operates this way. So I'm just going to show you the next layer now. So within the middle level commissioners, catchment are a number of sub-catchments, and you can see all of these coloured differently on the map, and each one of these sub-catchments is an internal drainage board, and they are responsible for managing the water that lands within that sub-catchment. And ultimately, the water that reaches the internal drainage board channels within those sub-catchments ultimately discharge into the middle level main channels, and again out to the tidal river Great Ouse. But a lot of those smaller internal drainage boards, they don't employ anybody, perhaps sometimes a district officer, so that would be responsible for the maintenance of the channels and the pumping stations. So a lot of those internal drainage boards look to middle level commissioners, which is the larger authority, to provide a range of services and advice and guidance, including engineering services, mechanical and electrical services. And I provide environmental and ecological advice and guidance and services to 36 of those internal drainage boards. They don't have to follow our advice, but thankfully most of them do. So I'll go on to a little bit more now about the range of services that we provide to them. You can see on your screen at the moment that within each one of those catchments, that's sort of the network of ditches and drainage channels that are within the IDBs that we provide services to. So I know we said hundreds of kilometres of drainage channels. It's actually thousands and thousands of kilometres of watercourse. And these can range from, you know, a couple of metres wide to some of the larger drainage tunnels, which are sort of 40, 45 metres wide at their widest. So we're not talking about little field drains here. You know, there's some significant waterways here that are a real value to biodiversity and nature. They are, as you know, sort of areas of refuge and very well connected in areas that are otherwise very intensively cultivated and developed. So they really are, you know, the heart of biodiversity in the middle level and in the fens. So just a bit of information now about how we've managed sort of species and biodiversity through our functions up until now. I came from ADA, as Roger said earlier, the Association of Drainage Authorities, which is the national representative for all internal drainage boards in the country, and I was the environmental lead there. And during my time, I produced a book called The Environmental Good Governance Guide for Internal Drainage Boards, and that has informed a number of documents and processes and procedures to help internal drainage boards better manage biodiversity since then. But before I started at middle level, I had some amazing predecessors who did some amazing work to conserve and enhance species before I started. So like we've said a number of times today, IDBs haven't always had the best reputation for managing species and biodiversity, and not to defend them in any way, but previously when some of these drainage channels have been dug They're all artificial, they're not natural. They were dug at a time hundreds of years ago before there was a need to have environmental provision within them. They were designed to convey a certain volume of water out to sea as soon as possible to reduce flood risk in the area. But now, with a range of increasing environmental legislation, those channels, a lot more is expected of them, and they have to be multifunctional. So previously, internal drainage boards had a bit of a rap for wanting to keep everything neat and clean, remove as much vegetation as possible. Things have changed, I'm pleased to say. So in order to kind of change that perception of internal drainage boards, in the public perception, and indeed to sort of change cultures within internal drainage boards, a number of flagship species were identified that needed a little bit of help in our area, and my predecessors have done a huge amount of work to conserve and enhance those. So there are now hundreds of barn owl boxes, hundreds of bat boxes installed throughout. We've got 85 artificial otter holts installed within the banks of the IDB channels throughout the middle level system. We run 28 mink rafts and traps and have been a big part of reducing the numbers of mink for the conservation of water vole. Previously, all this stuff has happened under the guidance of my predecessors over the last 20 years. We've started to introduce, where we can, some black poplar, which was native to the area. And I can show you a little map in a minute about how these some of these artificial habitats are located throughout the system. There's been kingfisher holes drilled everywhere, in sheep piling on bridges, under bridges, into banks. Numerous sand martin banks been created over the years. And so how we manage that on an IDB level is each IDB has a biodiversity action plan. Now, I know the action plans are a little bit, you know, they're sort of a document of the past, but actually they work really well for internal drainage boards. I'll show you a little bit about one of the ones that we've got. So this is for Ramsey, Upwood, Great Raveley, and it's just exactly how you would expect a biodiversity action plan to be formed. It highlights the key species and habitats of interest and conservation value within each internal drainage board area. So we have habitat action plans, and we've got species action plans for each internal drainage board that we provide advice and guidance to. So hopefully that is of interest. Those are publicly available on our website. I've made those available obviously to Gabriella, because I think they're important to inform some of the actions that can be identified in the local nature recovery strategies. What else was I going to tell you? So biodiversity action plans are now currently being updated. The Environment Act in 2021 strengthened the duties of internal drainage boards to not only conserve, but now to enhance species and habitats and biodiversity. And they have to consider local nature recovery strategies and species recovery strategies. So we're now in the process of getting all this information together and updating each biodiversity action plan. So we're really looking forward to the species recovery action plan, so that we can incorporate those species into the updated versions as well. On a day-to-day basis, we have a best practice operations manual at middle level, and that sets out the way that we manage and maintain our channels to be of benefit to a range of species. So that includes things like adapting our cutting regimes to take account of nesting birds along our channels. It includes things like rotational bank management, so that we would only leave one bank, we would only cut one bank one year and one bank the next, so there was an area of refuge. We have what I call the hot zone, where along all channels there is at least 1 metre of marginal vegetation that is retained, and 1 metre up the bank at least. On the larger channels it's much more, so that there is habitat and refuge for a range of aquatic and riparian species. We have to be able to cut the banks because we have to be able to inspect their condition. These are flood embankments. These are so they're vital to the community. So we do have to be able to manage these banks quite regularly, and we have to be able to maintain a clear line of passage, a safe line of passage for operatives working on those embankments. but we do adapt those cutting regimes. We only cut to a certain height. So a maximum of 10 centimetres, a minimum of 10 centimetres, sorry, is left to benefit any reptiles. We leave like I say, the marginal vegetation for water voles. We've also started to include things like reseeding areas of bank reformation and bank repair with a more species rich mix, which has got some broadleaf species and some pollinator supporting species. We're trialing some of that with different establishment methods such as hydroseeding, and it's just got more floristic species in. So we're looking at doing things like that.
Sophie, have you got your slides moving through? Because at the moment you're just stuck.
This is a big slide, sorry. There's no, I will move them through, but of course, yes, I'll keep them moving as much as possible. So in terms of the channels needing to be multifunctional, we are conveying water, so there's often been a need to strengthen some of those channel banks previously. With hard engineering, such as sort of wooden toe boards or sort of concrete bank stabilization, whereas now we're moving to more natural engineering means such as pre-planted coir roll, which provides more natural bank toe stabilization. We're trying to retain as many riparian trees and shrubs as we can to provide more otter habitat and more habitat for a range of wildlife species as well. When we work in the channel for desilting operations or weed cutting operations, we only focus on a maximum of the centre 1/3 of the channel to make sure that there is a margin left untouched for a range of aquatic species as well. So on your screen here, you can see the range of habitats that we've established and maintain. The larger brown dots are the artificial otter holts, black boxes are bat boxes, red are the barn owl boxes, the smaller black ones are kingfisher habitat that we've established. So there's a good legacy there from what my predecessors established that we're maintaining. So how we're trying to move on from that now is we've focused on those flagship species. It has resulted in a change of culture. It's raised the profile of the work of internal drainage boards and how they support species and habitats. But we're now looking with the local nature recovery strategy to focus on how we can improve the quality of the habitats that we manage to attract a wider range of species to them and support a wider range of species. And I've spoken about the coir rolls and the enhanced seed mixes there as well, rotational cutting. So this is an example of where some pre-planted coir roll has been installed as bank toe stabilisation along the 16-foot recently. So that's quite standard for us now. We're also looking at introducing things like floating pontoons as landing stages for our navigators rather than hard engineered landing stages. And we're including some biodiversity provisions in there. So things like fry cages on the bottom of those pontoons to provide a refuge for the smaller fish. We're developing some wildlife areas. We're trying to take back in hand some areas, some land that Middle Level and some of the IDBs own but have previously rented out for agriculture. We're taking all of that land back in-house now, and there's some significant areas there. So all around the Cardeer estate in Stanground, where there are a number of attenuation ponds, some sud features over a number of hectares. They're being brought back in-house now, and we're starting to develop plans to make those work harder for nature in the area. And all along the Middle Level main drain, there's land that we own either side of there. We're bringing that back in-house as well to make that work a little bit harder for biodiversity and connect some other more valuable wildlife sites. We work very closely with the Great Fen, and we're particularly interested in some of the species that they're looking at for sort of reintroduction. We spoke about water germander and the fen ragwort earlier, and certainly in our biodiversity action plans, we'll be looking to identify any suitable areas within each internal drainage board subcatchment for any reintroductions that we can help to support there as well. Our channels are some of the richest fisheries in the country, and St Germans has a number of fish-friendly eel pumps there, so that allows passage of eels into our system and passage back out again. But we're building, that's being refurbed at the moment, and we're building a new eel pass there. That is a bespoke one. There's nothing like it elsewhere in the country, but it is now designed to deal with some invasive non-native species that weren't a concern or a problem when the first eel pass was originally built. So we have more Chinese mitten crabs coming up the current eel pass than we do eels at the moment. We know that they're causing a bit of problem in our system. So the new eel pass is designed to intercept those Chinese mitten crabs and prevent their numbers increasing that way in the middle level system. And I've mentioned the local nature recovery strategies that we're integrating as well. So this is an example of one of those floating pontoons. This one's vegetated, some of them will be. Some of them could also be turn rafts on some of the wider channels as well, with some of the mesh, the fry mesh on the bottom. So it's important to mention our consenting process. One of the functions that an internal drainage board performs is to consent the work of others on the channels, in or around the channels actually. So even if a development is to take place several kilometres away from an internal drainage board channel, if that development is of a scale that could impact the flood risk and water level management within that catchment, then it needs to be considered. So all work like that happens within an internal drainage catchment will require the consent of an internal drainage board. Some of the larger developments that would be taking place will come to us through the planning system, and we have to review those planning applications to check that the proposed development and the proposed measures are compatible with the local flood risk and water levels. So some of those consents come to us directly, though, if they aren't coming through the local planning system. And the Environment Act gave us a statutory duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity through all of our functions. So this does include consenting, and it gives us the opportunity to seek better outcomes for biodiversity through that consenting function. So an example of that would be a farmer that wanted to install a culvert to improve access to a number of fields, or a residential user wanting to install a culvert, or somebody wanting to build a bridge or install sheet piling. All of that is activity that has to be consented by the Internal Drainage Board. Now, that enhancement part of the Environment Act is not as quantifiable as the net gain system. So it's quite subjective. How do we deliver enhancement? So what we're doing is really taking the key principles of biodiversity net gain here and applying them to our consenting process. So some of the key principles are, you wouldn't plant a tree to compensate for the loss of a pond. We're looking at like-for-like habitat compensation. And if you think about maybe if all the internal drainage boards across the middle level receive 100 applications each year for the installation of a culvert of one of those watercourses, and those are generally, say an average of 10 metres, that's 1 kilometre of watercourse, open habitat that is lost every year in the middle level system. And I'm not saying those figures are correct, but that just gives you an idea of, the statistics that we're using to drive our policy here. So we're adopting things like a no culverting policy, requesting things like clear span bridges where we can, and if it is absolutely necessary to install a 10-metre culvert, then we will be asking for an 11-metre section of open ditch to be created as close as possible to the point at which it has been lost, of the same or greater quality, again following those biodiversity net gain principles. So it also provides that system capacity, it maintains that system capacity as well. So we've got some good opportunities there to seek enhancement through our consenting function as well. So some of the challenges and opportunities that we're experiencing at the moment with this kind of obstructing us doing more is we're a little bit concerned about how BNG measures and undervalues drainage channels at the moment. Owen, I'm sure you will back me up on this, and I know that Jonathan Graham, who I work quite regularly with, is quite adamant that some of our drainage channels in the middle level system are some of the most diverse and rich in terms of plant species and aquatic species that there are Some species exist only in a number of other places across the UK, and certainly don't exist in some of the nature reserves that we have in some of the nicer drainage channels. Those species are there because they like the way that channel is being managed. So we're not keen to change too much in some of those places. So they're not as barren as maybe some of the policy would have you believe. So we are challenging some of the BNG metric condition assessments at the moment because they don't necessarily fit in our area. We do have a duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity, but we have no funding. We are publicly funded, so we are always looking for partnership funding, and we would like to work very closely with a number of local stakeholders to see if there's anything that we can complement and enhance together. We also have a lot of activity around peat restoration and paludiculture in this area that we're trying to support. And when we're talking about enhancement, so for example, going back to our consenting function as we did before, we quite often get planning applications come through that say, well, we've located a dry ditch within the red line boundary. It's not very deep. It only holds water every now and then. So we're going to fill it in. And we say, oh, and they haven't found any waterfowl there, for example. And we say, well, no, that's an opportunity to provide an enhanced habitat for waterfowl. So actually, as part of our consent, we would like you to deepen that channel and widen it. And actually, the indirect enhancement that you can provide is to install some water level management structures that can hold it, that can mean that that water does hold, that ditch does hold water for more in the year. So actually, you're enhancing in an indirect way by improving water level management even within a ditch. So, and that's the same for peat restoration and paludiculture. It's how we are using our water level management structure to improve the water levels in certain areas for the benefit of peat. We don't have any powers over water quality. We don't have any duties over water quality or water resource management, which is very difficult when you know that you've got a statutory duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity within the channels, but there is a water quality issue which we have no power over. So we work quite closely now with Anglian Water to understand some of the pinch points in our system and see how we can work together to address those. We're developing funding pathways to purchase better kits so we can manage some of the habitats that we do in a better way that achieves greater outcomes for biodiversity as well. But again, it's all about funding. So I hope that gives you a little bit more information around internal drainage boards and how we're trying to sort of deliver our statutory duties and deliver better outcomes for a range of species. But I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie. That's really interesting, and you know, I hope that for those who didn't know what was going on out there in the middle level, they certainly know now. We have a few minutes for questions. Are there any direct questions to Sophie, but not the general questions, but direct questions on what Sophie's been talking about? Can you raise your? I can't see at the moment anyone who's questions. Okay. We'd like to raise your hands this time rather than me read questions out. Anybody's put a question into chat for Sophie, if you raise your hand, you can ask it now.
I can't raise my hand, I don't know where it is. But I just, if that's okay, I had a quick question about this water quality, that you have no powers to influence water quality, so you depend on Anglian Water or some other authority to do that. But then water quality presumably impacts the quality of the habitat for the species recovery. How do we get the pressure in the right place to get our water quality the way it should be?
And that this is key for partnership working here. So IDBs have quite often been sort of the lead partner on things like water level management plans for some of our statutory sites. And that's been quite frustrating for internal drainage boards because they have then responsibility to influence the condition status of some of our, more sensitive water reliant sites with no powers or duties over the water quality, when in fact it's water quality that's in fact affecting the favourable status of a number of those, key habitats. So all we can do, Sue, is work in partnership. We can do all we can, but we have to work more closely with those that do have the powers and the responsibility over water quality, and we're improving those relationships all the time. You know, those lines of communication are open, and when we're thinking about doing any work in a particular area and we can bring people like Anglian Water on board, then we do. But we're small but mighty in the middle level and internal drainage board. So another thing that we're doing, for example, is we've got some DEFRA policy developers coming over to see us soon to talk about how we can develop environmental stewardship options that are compatible with the management of some of the drains in our area, so that can sit, you know, previously farmers and landowners have been very reluctant to establish stewardship margins on their land, because the internal drainage board will come along and you know, damage it in some way. You know, it happens if we've got bank repairs to do, so they've been penalised for that. So we're working with DEFRA now to try and help them understand what kind of measures they can develop and make available to farmers in the lowland areas where there are internal drainage board channels that can help to address some of things like water quality, surface water runoff, you know, things like that. Just things that will work better in a lowland context, because many of them haven't previously. So it's all about partnership working too.
Thanks for what you said. There are other questions. Sorry, there's 3 hands up. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time to hear Owen and our general discussion. So maybe you could answer those questions, Sophie, directly to you that are in the chat. You can answer them in the chat, or we can raise them again in the general discussion afterwards. So sorry about that. Okay, so we come on to our final presentation then. And I say thanks a lot, Sophie. Our final presentation is from Owen Mountford on species recovery intensive farmland, the utility of the Fenland flora. So while Owen's slides are being put up, I'll just introduce him. He's a naturalized feminine botanist. He's lived in and around the Fen since the 1960s. He used to work at the ITE Monk's Wood for over 30 years. His research focused on 4 broad areas there: vegetation conservation of linear habitats, impact for drainage and hydrology on wetland habitats, the use of agri-environment schemes on restoring species-rich habitats, and then nature conservation in EU accession states, especially Romania, where he now lives half his time. Since he retired from CEH in 2016, he's devoted much of his time on surveying Fenland with John Graham and compiling a floron which covers the entire basin. So it's not just Cambridgeshire. Anyway, off you go, Owen. Tell us what you've been up to.
Bună ziua tot. Hey, hello to everyone. I'm going to be sort of nudging Helen to move my slides along. So if it comes across a little haltingly occasionally, please forgive me. This talk is partly a description of what the Fenland flora has done, but it's also focuses principally on how the mapping information coming out of the Fenland flora can be used to target activity. So could have my next slide, please, Helen? Next slide. Hello?
Is your Wi-Fi not working, Helen, your broadband?
I'm not quite sure. I'm using the page down button, but I'm not sure what the issue is. Do apologise.
Do you want me to try and share it from here?
Or give it to me?
See if I can transfer the... I'm not sure if that's... It was working when I tested this, so my page up and page down functions are not operating as they should. So
have you got it loaded on your end?
I'd have to come off this screen for the moment.
I'll try again.
Okay.
Unless Owen wants to try.
Helen, if it helps, page down didn't work on mine, but just simply clicking did for some reason.
Okay, I'll
Okay,
try.
I've got it loaded on mine. I can try and no.
Try see if clicking works.
How about that? Yes, it's telling me now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. That is from me, I think.
Okay, try and move on then. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So the old-fashioned way works. Right. So just a bit of history. Fenland is often dismissed as very flat and boring. But historically, we have a wetland of huge international importance, particularly for tall herb-rich fen, but for areas of raised bog and mire forest. It was a landscape with the largest lakes in lowland Britain. It had remarkable alluvial wetlands associated with the rivers and estuaries, and it still has amongst the most extensive salt marshes in Britain. I'm not really going to talk much about the historical changes here, but except to make a few points now, and when I describe another habitat later. The drainage had the effect of creating in this wetland landscape lowland meadows, the drainage channels and navigations that Sophie's been talking about, and left behind here and there relic fragments that were retained because of their economic importance, either for peat cutting or for reed or whatever. So why did we go about writing a Fenland flora? I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I think it might have merit in terms of this kind of integrated approach to species recovery. We wanted to focus on a more natural unit, something that was defined by geology and soils, by climate, by landscape, by land use history, by ecology, rather than what is an artificial construct of the county. We wanted to answer questions within that natural unit as to what changes had occurred and what were the causes of these changes and what were the causes of the distributions. So we hope it's more of a holistic account than most floras and not a mix of disparate elements, but still valuable. And we had a little bit of what you might call fen tiger nationalism. We wanted to draw attention to a region which has often been the poor relation of conservation in upland parts of our counties. We've looked into all these subjects in writing our flora, and I want you, basically, I just ask you to look at that list rather than for me to talk about it. The importance being that these are the factors that have influenced the distribution of species in the past, which influence the distribution of species now, and which are continually cited as we deal with individual species. The flora does have dot maps. There is an example of a dot map based upon tetrads of the national grid. That's a 2x2 kilometre square. And as well as the usual things that you'd expect, we divide up our analysis of the species distribution on the basis of pre-1970, the 1970s through 1999, and from 2000 onwards. And in the discussion, we also look in depth at the 19th century and before as a separate unit. So the idea is to look at the historical change in the flora, but also, and you'll see an item down the bottom there, to look at the analysis, to analyze the distribution of the species as they currently are, and see which species, I should say, have similar distributions one to another, and might therefore form assemblages for understanding dispersal and possibly for understanding mechanisms for the restoration of nature more widely in the Fenland. Okay, now then, we have certain species which get a much more brief distribution account simply because they're uncommon, but that's fewer than 20 records for Fenland. But that includes some of our key species of Fenland biodiversity, like the fen woodrush you see on the right there, Ludzula pallescens. We're also not confined just to vascular plants. We're also looking at stoneworts, and we have summary accounts of bryophyta and algae. I suspect the algae one will be one of the most novel features of this flora. We can therefore look at habitats very broadly and categorize them as to whether they are natural in origin, so that would include the true fens, the salt marshes and parts of the rivers. We then have a group of habitats which reflect the drainage impact, so that would include the various drainage channels, the hierarchy of drains present within there. Water bodies created for irrigation or for winning minerals. The infrastructure of our drainage network, so the flood banks, both inland and coastal, and the washlands, which, as some maps I'm going to show you soon, are amongst the most distinctive and diverse habitats that we have. Old reclamation therefore allowed a group of species into Fenland that might not otherwise have found a place in the natural wetlands. So we have old grassland species, dry grassland species, we have hedgerow and shelter belt species coming in. And clearly we also have those that are associated with habitation and urbanization. Even if that urbanization is just a knot of little houses on a drain bank, they create new habitats that allow new species to come in. But overwhelmingly, our major habitat type is arable farming. Now, we're fortunate in that Mark Hill, one of the most renowned numerical ecologists of the last 50 or 60 years, was a colleague of mine at Monkswood and at Wallingford, and worked closely also with John in bryological studies. And he was able to do an analysis of all our distribution data using a technique that I will refer to, but I have to come clean and say I don't understand. It's a spherical k-means clustering analysis. And from that, he created 20 separate species clusters, which you see listed there. The species that's mentioned is the most constant species within each of those 20 clusters. The cluster name is one we've coined based on studying the assemblage of species that these clusters suggest, and the number of species in the cluster is given on the right. So rich fen is a crucial one, but so interestingly are the urban ones of wall, churchyard and homestead for sheer number of species. There may be outwith our interest today, but the dry grassland one is of some interest, and I'll come to that in a moment. So what Mark was able to produce from our distributional data were summary maps that show the co-occurrence of species, the species that belong in each of these clusters. And these maps that I show you have a sort of 3-scale classification. If it's a large brown dot, there are many species of that group represented at that point. Small brown, moderately well represented, and the rest are the poorly represented ones. Not so. All these maps then are of that broad style, and some of the maps do show patterns which will come as absolutely no surprise to anyone here. So the semi-natural, the rich fen cluster is centred on Wicken in the bottom right, on Wood Walton and Home, but also has outliers at Baston in Lincolnshire and at one or two places along the Norfolk fringe of Fenland. Slightly more widely distributed is the peat woodland cluster, which has resulted in some parts from natural colonization of abandoned land by trees and shrubs, and sometimes from plantations, but has an assemblage which is very rich in different bryophytes and in a large number of ferns. Once again, it's Home and Wood Walton that emerge as important areas, but that West Norfolk fringe between the sort of Downham Market area and going up almost as far as Hunstanton becomes important, and a few places around the upper edge of the Witham catchment, southeast of Lincoln. Of more direct interest to Cambridgeshire people then are clusters like the Washland one. And these are species which are overwhelmingly distributed on the washes of the Ouse and the Nene, but also sparingly along the Cam, and here and there on the Glen, and in a few places on the Witham, further north in Lincolnshire. So a very distinctive assemblage of aquatics, wet grassland species, and also species of drawdown habitats, in other words, places which are seasonally flooded, but which then dry out from midsummer onwards, exposing open ground, which they then colonize. I wanted to echo very much many of Sofi's messages, and some of the clusters that I'm now going to show you reflect the crucial importance of watercourses within Fenland biodiversity. We have altogether 4 watercourse clusters. One is associated with main drains and rivers, and you'll see that it picks out many of the larger IDB drains as well as the big canalized rivers. That it tends to fade out where there is any brackish influence. So this is very much a freshwater assemblage of species. The vegetated ditch is the other end of the story, in a sense, the most species poor of the watercourse assemblages. These are usually field ditches dominated by reeds and burr reeds and other tall emergent species. So there you have a couple of the characteristic species of these 2 watercourse types, the yellow water lily and the branched burr reed. Between those, and particularly associated with IDB ditches and drains, those that are under grazing management, even field ditches, and those which maybe for draining of tracks and roads are more regularly maintained. So the clean ditch cluster includes even tiny ditches, but which retain open water throughout the year because their drainage function is so key to their to the viability of the farm and or the local economy. And so many of these are associated with the upland edge, where they're receiving water coming off the uplands. But we also have this cluster, again, well distributed on the washlands. Drain edge is particularly an IDB type. It picks up parts of the middle level, and it's that area where we're not talking really about the aquatics, but those species which demand that the ditch be cleaned, that the ditch bank be cleaned, and that tall rank growth is suppressed. But the story in Fenland is no longer that of wetlands pure and simple. It includes things that, as Fenmen, we would think of as upland species. And some of them are really quite interesting and show a potential for Fenland to contribute to species recovery well outside its, if you like, its wetland remit. There are significant areas of old and less fertile grassland. Some of these are to do with meadows and pastures around the edge of the Fen Islands, which were retained for draft animals and latterly for ponies and so on. But they also include the large flood banks of the main drains, which have had grassland on them now for 200 years or more and have acquired a very rich flora. Woody growth is coming back, and we have all sorts of hedgerows and shelter belts and amenity plantings. And we have churchyards and walls, which create small areas of nature conservation value, again, with constancy of management over many decades and sometimes over centuries. A couple of then the very widespread clusters worth a mention here. Old verges and banks, that tends to be a map of the main flood bank systems in Fenland, but does include the older drove roads. So you'll see there is a strong pattern towards the wash in the areas known as the townlands, from King's Lynn through Holbeach, Spalding and further then northward, which were reclaimed early, but also on the islands further south, the Cambridgeshire Islands of March, Chatteris, Ramsey, and so on, and Ely in particular. We have species surviving on verges that are prone to regular mowing, and this seems to reflect a rather more attentive focus on mowing in North Lincolnshire and in Norfolk than in many parts of Cambridgeshire. In many parts of rural Cambridgeshire, Fenland, verges tend to be ranker than in these other counties. Here are maps I just really do want to make a quick couple of points about. Old grassland, therefore, is present in places like Swavesey and Soham, which are within the Fenland Basin, at Chettisham near Ely, and associated with the old Fenland National Nature Reserves. But notice that terrific cluster around about Wisbeach, where on the canalised Neen outfall, where you have some of the richest grasslands anywhere within our region. A habitat which certainly would have had no part in the primeval Fenland are those which have been created by industry and transport on abandoned railways, on gravel and clay pits, and yet have now been colonised for at least a century in many cases. The railways themselves were colonised as they were built in the 19th century, and then the abandoned ones became green lanes, if you will, in the 1960s and since. But there are important areas there around Whittlesea, down towards the Great Fen. And the other areas in Norfolk and Lincolnshire you see there are also gravel winning areas. Woody growth in Fenland tends to be associated then with the old areas of reclamation, the older hedges on the townlands that I referred to, and then with the gravel and clay pits and the fen relics. But there are also important woody habitats which are acquiring shade species and woodland species, where shelter belts of poplars and alders have been created and new species have come in under their shade. I'm going to pass through this very quickly, really, but it does. But the urban effect, which is most apparent in what we call the homestead cluster, is present in all the to a greater or lesser extent, in all the inhabited parts of Fenland. But that does add huge diversity. Another cluster which I'm not going, two clusters to which I'm not going to dwell on to any extent are ordinary roads, which where we have the wayside cluster, which is essentially ubiquitous, and the various arable clusters, which are mainly ubiquitous, but have a subset which is associated with peaty and chalky soils under broad-leaved crops.
Can you conclude in the next few minutes, please, Owen?
Okay, I'm almost there, Roger. Just a few maps to show you the kind of distributions. There's two scarce species that characterize important fenland habitats. We have the pyramidal orchid coming in on old grassland, and we have a classic one of washland. There is the diversity or species richness map, more strictly, for Fenland. It picks up Wicken Fen and Ely as the most important places in our region, but also emphasises how much richer much of the Cambridgeshire Fenland is than the Silt Fen. So, for recovery, where do we set our baseline? Do we set it from the Bronze Age or from later stages of history? We can use the 21st century range to define where a species assemblage occurs and where restoration or recovery is potentially successful. So these come out directly from the mapping and the Mark Hill analysis. And if we therefore combine today's availability of species and the historical range of taxa, we have a guideline for species recovery in Fenland, which can be integrated with what Sofi was talking about and build on the mobility and connectivity that the drainage channels provide. Okay, sorry, yes, as usual, I went on too long, Roger. Off you go.
Thanks much indeed, Owen. Well, we really have run out of time. It's nearly midday. We said we'd finish. I'd say a couple of things myself. I would like to thank the speakers very much. I mean, I hope you've all found that as enjoyable, as interesting as I have. Obviously, there's a lot more to discuss. I will talk to some of you, including the speakers and my colleagues in Natural Cambridgeshire and Gabriella and people and Phil, and see if we can't have another meeting about this a bit later on too, which will be more of a discussion meeting to help to sort of think about how we can coordinate all our efforts, our views, our ambitions, our aspirations for a species recovery, a master species recovery plan program for Cambridgeshire. So it's sort of a promise that I'll try and do that, because I did want a 20-minute discussion today, but I thought the presentation was so interesting, I did let them go on. So unless there's anything who wants to say about the generality quickly, I want to conclude this meeting. Is there anyone want to say anything about the generality?
One quick footnote is that water quality emerges from our work, as it does from Sofi's, as a key factor in the viability of species and habitats.
Yeah. And isn't that some of that to do with the where you've got the natural springs around the islands as well, Owen, as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, there's an awful lot more to discuss. I mean, I feel quite frustrated because I'd like to have engaged a lot of that. There's been some really interesting things in the chat as well. Can we send the chat? I mean, everyone's read the chat presumably. Helen, can we send the chat round to people? We can catch this all?
Yeah, we do that. Yeah. We do that anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the chat will be sent to you all, and there will be a recording of the presentation. And do we send that to everyone? Or send them the link to the recording, do we, Helen?
Yes, we did. Peter does. Yes, we do that later today or early tomorrow.
Okay. Okay, so you're going to get the chat and you're going to get the recording later today. And I'll just say, again, I will work with my colleagues and see if we can't have another meeting about species recovery in Cambridgeshire, linked to the LNRS and all the other things we're doing. I mean, I've been working on this sort of thing for 50 years or more, and honestly, there's so much going on now, and it's difficult to get your head around it, but it is quite encouraging. But we've got to get these species back and get the habitats back to support them too. Okay.
Roger, quick question for Owen. Is there a target publication date for your book?
Yes, it should be published early in 2025. The text is essentially finished. It's going to our internal reviewers in the next 2 to 3 months. It's going to be huge. It's going to be published probably in two. It's going to be published in 2 volumes. Because the printing will occur over the winter of this year next, and publication next year.
Thank you.
Who's publishing it, Owen?
Pisces, part of the Nature Bureau group.
Tim, you have your hand up?
Just a very quick update for those that are interested in the grantor and water. I am having a meeting tomorrow afternoon with Water Resources East, hopefully to go forward with the concept of trialling a recharge pit to feed the grantor and try and increase some storage in the underground reservoir. And so we might be making progress on that front. Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, well, on that happy note, as it is now midday, I think we'll conclude the meeting. So thanks all for joining. Many thanks again for the presentations. And let me repeat myself, I do just hope you found it as interesting and as enjoyable as I did. And we will look to sort of reconvene as soon as we can. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye everybody. Bye.